Consul-General Maren Oduya of the Varith Interstellar Trade Commission had spent 11 years building a reputation for precision. Every contract she signed had been reviewed 7 times before her pen touched it. Every aide she hired had passed 3 separate evaluation rounds. Every decision she made had been, in her own words, considered. So when she submitted her formal request to the Coalition Logistics Bureau for a field escort to accompany her delegation during the Halveth Corridor negotiations, the criteria she attached were detailed enough that the assignment officer had to request a second screen to display them all. Security clearance at or above level 6, minimum 8 years field experience. Fluency in diplomatic protocol, no prior incidents flagged under the Bureau's conduct review system. And the criterion she had bolded and underlined both, the ability to operate without drawing attention to themselves. Because the last thing a trade negotiation of this scale needed was a bodyguard who looked like a bodyguard. The Bureau processed her request and assigned Specialist Callum Bryce, what the Bureau did not include in the assignment packet. Not through malice, not through incompetence, but through the specific kind of administrative failure that happens when 3 different filing systems are trying to communicate with each other, and 2 of them are running on legacy infrastructure, was the single document that would have changed everything. Specialist Bryce's deployment history was in the packet. His commendation records were in the packet. His conduct evaluations, all of them satisfactory, were in the packet. What was not in the packet was page 4 of his standard personnel file, which listed, under the subheading Planetary Origin and Environmental Classification, the words, Earth. Class 12 Deathworld. Maren met Bryce at the transit dock at 0630, which was already 30 minutes later than she had intended, because one of her junior attaches had misread the departure board and nearly sent the entire delegation to the wrong terminal. She was still recalibrating when she found Bryce standing at the designated meeting point with a travel bag over one shoulder and the particular quality of stillness that very few people ever actually managed. He was unremarkable to look at. Medium height, a lean, functional kind of build, brown hair cut in a way that suggested practicality rather than vanity. The kind of man who could stand in the background of a diplomatic reception and have every alien dignitary in the room look straight through him. She had found that quality in exactly 3 people over the course of her career. All 3 had turned out to be exceptionally good at their jobs. Specialist Bryce, she said, he said, and followed her toward the transport without being asked. He did not fill silence with conversation during the transit. He read her briefing documents on a handheld, made a series of small notations she did not ask about, and when she did have questions about the station layout, answered them in the kind of direct, stripped-down sentences that suggested he had already been thinking about the answers before she asked. By the time they docked at Halveth Station, she had revised her initial assessment from adequate to possibly quite good, which for Maren Oduya was a significant upgrade. Halveth Station was not built for comfort. It had been designed as a neutral meeting point, which in practice meant it belonged entirely to no one, and was maintained by everyone, which further meant that its maintenance was uneven, its climate systems ran slightly too cold, and its corridors had the low-ceilinged institutional quality of a building that had been retrofitted for diplomatic use, without anyone asking whether it had any business being used that way in the first place. The negotiations Maren was attending occupied 3 floors of the station's eastern wing, 16 delegations, 412 registered attendees, and, distributed across the station in varying states of alertness, a security presence representing 9 different coalition members, none of whom were entirely certain whose jurisdiction applied to which corridor, and all of whom had decided, as a practical matter, to simply be polite to each other and hope for the best. The station's containment level was on sub-level 4. Most of the delegates were not supposed to know about sub-level 4. The Coalition Research Division maintained it for reasons that the public-facing documentation described, with characteristic vagueness as ongoing xenobiological survey and sample management. Maren knew about it because 11 years in trade negotiation meant knowing things that were not technically in the public documentation. She had noted its existence in her pre-arrival briefing and then filed it in the part of her mind reserved for things that were unlikely to be relevant. The negotiations began well, ran into a procedural dispute on the second morning, recovered by afternoon, and by the end of the third day were proceeding at the particular pace of diplomacy everywhere, which is to say slow, careful, and punctuated by long breaks in which everyone ate food they did not particularly enjoy, and had conversations they had already had before in slightly different rooms. Bryce was present throughout. He positioned himself at the edge of whatever space she occupied, visible enough to function, unobtrusive enough not to register. During breaks, he moved through the station's corridors with the methodical attention of someone who was continuously updating a map in his head. Once, she noticed him stop in the middle of a hallway, look at a ventilation panel for approximately 4 seconds, and then continue walking. She did not ask what he had been looking at. She suspected she already knew, in a general sense, and that the specifics were his area rather than hers. On the morning of the 4th day, Bryce appeared at her door 20 minutes before her scheduled departure for the negotiation floor and said, with the same tone he might use to discuss the schedule, "One of the sub-level access hatches has been showing irregular pressure readings for the last 18 hours. I flagged it with station security yesterday morning. I haven't received a response." Maren put down her briefing notes. "How irregular?" "Enough to matter," he said. "I've rerouted your path for today. We'll be taking the north core to the floor rather than the main atrium." She looked at him. He looked at her. She picked up her briefing notes. "How far out of the way is the north corridor?" she asked. 4 minutes, he said. "Fine," she said. The incident did not happen in the north corridor. It happened in the main atrium at 11:14 station time, while Maren was in the middle of a bilateral session with the Vorthen commercial delegation and Bryce was outside in the hall. The research team on sub-level 4 had been transporting a specimen. The specimen in question was a Carath stalker, a quadrupedal predator from the Vesk system that the Xenobiology Division's intake documentation classified as highly territorial, environmentally adaptive, and demonstrably resistant to standard containment protocols when agitated. The transport container had been rated for the specimen's weight and strength. What the rating had not adequately accounted for was the specimen's intelligence, specifically its apparently thorough understanding of the structural weak points of its container, which it had spent the previous 6 hours identifying and, at 11:09 station time, systematically addressing. By 11:14 the Carath was in the main atrium. The station security team responded immediately and professionally, which is to say they were in the atrium within 90 seconds, established a perimeter, and then encountered the specific problem that made the Carath one of the more studied specimens in the Coalition's Xenobiology catalog. The creature's adaptive response to perceived threats included a threat mapping behavior identified across 14 separate observation records, in which it would assess all vectors simultaneously before committing to an attack direction. Security could close the perimeter. They could not close it without creating a gap, and the Carath, per every observation record on file, would find the gap. There were approximately 60 people in or adjacent to the main atrium. There was one gap in the security perimeter on the north side. Because the north side was where the corridor connecting to the bilateral session rooms opened into the atrium, and closing it would mean either exposing the security team's flank or cutting off the evacuation route for the delegates still exiting the session rooms. Bryce came through the north corridor at 11:16. He had heard the alert through his comm unit and processed the relevant details in the time it took to cover the 40 meters between the bilateral hallway entrance and the atrium. Carath stalker. Loose in main atrium, security perimeter incomplete. North access corridor open. He came through the corridor entrance and stopped. The Carath was approximately 12 meters away, in the center of the atrium, in the middle of its threat assessment behavior. The security team had the other 3 sides. The delegates were mostly behind them or moving toward the exits. The gap in the perimeter was where Bryce was standing. He assessed the situation in the specific way that 14 years of assignments had made automatic. Not rapidly, not anxiously, but with the calibrated completeness of someone who had learned, on a planet that did not offer second assessments, how to read an environment correctly the first time. The Carath completed its threat scan and found him. The observation records for the species noted that its threat assessment behavior typically culminated in action within 4 to 7 seconds. The research coordinator, watching from the mezzanine level, who had spent 6 years studying Carath behavioral patterns, would later record in her incident report that what happened next did not match any documented behavior in the species catalog. The Carath looked at Bryce for 22 seconds. Not at the security team. Not at the 60 civilians. At Bryce specifically, with the sustained and unbrokenest attention of a creature recalibrating its understanding of what it was looking at. Bryce looked back. He had the stillness of something that was not prey and knew it. Not because he was trying to project that quality, but because it was simply accurate. He had grown up on a planet where every ecosystem had been, for the entirety of human evolutionary history, trying various approaches to the problem of ending him, and his nervous system had internalized that context at a level that no amount of diplomatic training could replicate, and no threat assessment algorithm could fake. The Carath made a sound, low, something between a vibration and a warning. The research coordinator recognized it as the vocalization the species used, in 14 recorded instances, with other Carath. Not prey, not rival, something else. Then it lunged, because the Carath was not a diplomatic species and had reached the limit of its patience with categorization. What followed lasted 31 seconds. The station's security footage, reviewed 7 times in the subsequent inquiry, showed a sequence of events that the inquiry panel's report described as difficult to assess using standard threat response benchmarks. Bryce moved into the lunge rather than away from it. He used the creature's momentum, the atrium's support pillar, and a sequence of applied leverage that the panel's physical assessment consultant noted would have required a precise understanding of the specimen's skeletal structure, a very high tolerance for physical contact with an apex predator, and the specific kind of functional fearlessness that the consultant's report described, in a footnote, as not commonly observed outside Class 10 or higher environmental origin profiles. At the end of 31 seconds, the Carath was subdued on the atrium floor. It was not seriously injured. Neither was Bryce, technically, though the medical team's post-incident assessment noted a fractured rib, significant bruising across his left arm and shoulder, and a claw scoring on his neck that had stopped 3 centimeters short of something that would have made the rest of the inquiry considerably more complicated. Bryce was crouching next to the specimen when the security team reached him. He looked up at the team leader and said, with the tone of someone discussing a minor administrative matter, "You'll want containment from sub-level 4. The field contact protocols in the standard kit won't hold it." The security team leader stared at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Right." Maren was informed of the situation by her senior attaché who had been in the atrium for the final 12 seconds of the incident and was still visibly recalibrating. She was escorted to the atrium's side entrance, where she stood and looked at the scene. A subdued apex predator occupying a significant portion of the floor, a security team moving with the energy of people who had been prepared to deal with a crisis and were now dealing with the paperwork implications of not having had to, and Bryce, sitting on a bench near the north corridor entrance while a medical technician did something to his shoulder that he was clearly paying less attention to than the security team's containment procedure. 11 years of diplomatic experience. Maren had survived a delegation walkout that had ended a 4-month negotiation in 90 seconds. She had been in the room during a succession dispute that had briefly, for about 40 minutes, technically qualified as an armed conflict under coalition treaty definitions. She had once talked a Vorthan trade commissioner out of a position that his entire government had publicly committed to, in a conversation that had lasted 7 hours and had required at one point her to correctly identify a piece of obscure Vorthan agricultural law from memory. She had not seen anything like this. The station's head of security reached Bryce, looked at the atrium, looked at Bryce, and did a short mental calculation that was visible on his face even from across the room. "Origin world," he said, not as a question. "Earth," Bryce said. The security chief exhaled through his nose in a way that contained a significant amount of meaning, none of it quite expressible in words, and then turned to begin organizing his team. Maren crossed the atrium and stood in front of Bryce. The medical technician glanced at her, took in her expression, and found somewhere else to be. "Your file," she said, choosing her words with the care she brought to treaty language, "did not mention an environmental origin classification." Bryce considered this. "Was it on the criteria list?" he asked. A pause. "No," she said. "Your criteria were experience, discretion, and protocol awareness," he said. "I flagged the sub-level pressure issue 30 hours before the incident. I rerouted your path this morning. I closed the perimeter gap when there wasn't a safe way to close it otherwise." He looked at his shoulder, where the medical technician had left a temporary seal, and appeared to find the assessment satisfactory. "I addressed the criteria." Maren looked at him with the focused attention of someone revising a document they had considered final. "The Carath stopped," she said. "For 22 seconds. I know. It doesn't do that. Things from Earth don't present as prey," Bryce said. "We've had a long time to develop that. Class 12 doesn't happen quickly." There was a pause. The sounds of the atrium filtered around them, security teams, the low-frequency vibration of the containment equipment that had finally arrived from sub-level 4, Somewhere in the distance, the muffled sound of 60 delegates being told by station staff that the situation was resolved and that the afternoon session would proceed on schedule. Class 12, Maren said. Yes, Bryce said. Another pause. The file said Class 4, she said. The file, Bryce said in a tone that was not quite dry and not quite pointed and was somehow both, was working from legacy infrastructure. The afternoon session proceeded on schedule. Bryce was present at Maren's side for all of it, minus 40 minutes in the early afternoon that he spent with the station's medical team, and from which he returned with the same quality of settled quiet he had had that morning at the transit dock, as though the intervening events had been a minor logistical matter that had been appropriately dealt with. The negotiations concluded successfully 5 days later. The Halveth Corridor Agreement, as it became known, was ratified by 14 of the 16 delegations, with the remaining 2 entering a separate facilitated process that Maren would oversee the following quarter. It was, by any measure, the most significant trade outcome in the Vareth Commission's recent history. Consul-General Maren Oduya submitted a formal commendation to the Coalition Logistics Bureau for Specialist Callum Bryce's conduct during the Halveth Station incident. The commendation was detailed. It described his pre-incident risk assessment, his rerouting decision, his management of the atrium perimeter gap, and his conduct during and after the engagement with the Careth specimen. It was 4 paragraphs long, which was 3 paragraphs longer than any commendation Maren had previously submitted in her career. Attached to the commendation, addressed separately to the Bureau's Assignment Division, was a secondary document of 11 words. Please ensure planetary origin classification is included in all future assignment packets. The Assignment Division updated their transfer documentation template the following week. The update was applied to the legacy system integration 18 months later because that was how long it took to schedule the maintenance window. By that time, Bryce had been assigned to 4 more postings. The classification had not been in any of the packets. The commendations had been, without exception, very good.